Hi everyone, welcome to the Befores and Afters podcast. I'm Ian Fales from Befores and Afters. Today we're looking at the Robert Zemeckis film Pinocchio, currently streaming on Disney Plus, and the visual effects work in it by MPC. I talked to MPC visual effects supervisor Ben Jones about bringing several of the characters to life, and about being part of the very large virtual production effort employed on the film. That effort was shepherded by many people, including, of course, production VFX soup Kevin Bailey and VFX producer Sandra Scott, and a number of companies working in this space like Halon, Mold 3D, Dimension Studios, and several others. Let's jump into the conversation with MPC's Ben Jones about the film now. Hi Ben, how's it going?
Hi Ian, it's great. How are you?
I'm good. Just before we jumped on, I was reflecting on the last time I talked to you, which was for a really fun Lion King article, mostly about a dung beetle.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, my favorite character in the movie. Yeah.
Mine too, actually. Um, but congratulations on the work in Pinocchio. Just for people who don't know, can you explain it might sound obvious, MPC was the visual effects studio behind the work, but the extent of work that MPC had to do on the film.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Pinocchio was great in terms of we got involved really early with Bob Zemeckis, who's everyone knows a legendary director, and Kevin Bailey was the visual effects supervisor for the production, and we got involved early. Which meant that we sort of were involved with the virtual production and all the post-production and sort of the shoots and everything on the movie, which was great. We were the sole vendor for the visual effects, so we sort of did the whole movie. I think it ended up being 920 shots, I think, ish, which actually is an interesting number because for a whole movie,
that
that's
sounds
quite
low.
cool.
That sounds really low. Okay, I've got to stop you there. Is it because the shots are long? Or is it for a special reason?
Yeah, I mean, Bob Zemeckis said, he's relatively sort of well known for doing that. He likes his long takes, and he's always sort of challenging himself to try and like tell the story in one shot rather than cut it up into a few. So yeah, they're relatively long shots that we had to deal with. Yeah.
Whenever I interview Kevin about a film, I always ask him, "What was the Zemeckis shot that killed you?" And so I haven't got to him yet for this one, but I'm sure there's one. Maybe there's one for you as well, Ben. But anyway, but you mentioned the virtual production side of this film there. And that's interesting to me because I'm covering, of course, more and more films and shows with a heavy virtual production component. I'm really curious about, what they did do on the film, Kevin and other virtual production supervisors and companies and MPC as well. But then how that was kind of packaged up for MPC or what you ultimately received, apart from live action plates. Can you sort of talk about that side of it, Ben?
Sure, yeah. So the thing that was really super critical for Bob in this movie, from the outset, was that he really wanted an animation team that was going to be the animation team for virtual production and previs and the movie. And so instead of someone else, a previous company necessarily doing the animation, he wanted to talk to his animators and sort of be involved from that as if he would with actors. And so what we did at MPC was we sort of supplied the animation for that virtual production part. And we worked really closely with a couple of other vendors, Mold 3D, who did all the sort of environment builds, and Halon, who were the sort of main sort of vendor who ran the stage, the virtual production stage and things like that. So there were sort of three companies and we were all like heavily integrated. We were supplying the animation. Those guys were supplying environments and setting up scenes and things in Unreal. So Unreal was the main, software that we used for that. We all sort of shared the project with Perforce and we sort of, collaborated pretty closely on that. And what that did for us was that allowed, us to sort of be involved in the scenes to a certain degree, or at least know what was coming in terms of what the sets looked like and what virtual sets looked like. And it also allowed our animation team to, literally be the ones who were animating the shots for real in later down the line and had already got all Bob's, feedback and seen the progression of the shots, what he was sort of after for through previs as well.
That's also interesting to me being involved so early in animation, knowing that, of course, there's a final animation step down the way, how how complete, how final could this animation for the purposes of the virtual production shoot, viz, and on-set work? How final could that be? I mean, were there very long conversations about movement of Pinocchio and other characters, and were there lots of tests done? I mean, you would normally do that anyway for visual effects
Yeah,
work.
yeah, there were. I mean, what it did mean was that for the most part, although I think some of the characters changed a little bit, but for the most part, all the characters had to be sort of designed, built, and ready earlier than they might be in terms of even the final proportions and things like that of all the characters. So that was one thing that we did have to do in a previous sort of style sort of way is define those characters. But the animation, both Kevin and Bob were sort of really keen to push the quality of it at that stage to see how good we could get it. But there is an inherent difference at that stage, which is that the animation team are working in these master scenes. So they're basically animating 7,000 frames of something.
Right.
And maybe only 1,000 frames will actually end up in the movie of that particular scene, because our animators will animate it in continuity. So there's no gaps. Jiminy will, take an example of like Jiminy in Geppetto's workshop where he's jumping along all these sort of clock walls and things like that. Our animators would animate, his entire journey throughout this. And then, in the end, sort of in the end result movie, that ends up as, some little sequences and some cutaways and things like that. So we wanted to push the quality, but I think at the end of the day, there's a significant difference in terms of acting to shots, like individual shots, and also at that point, you don't know what's going to even be in the movie, really.
Mm. And because you're delivering that animation for Unreal, is there? I mean, and the things that can be done in Unreal are just incredible now, really.
Yeah.
In terms of ray tracing, and the virtual cinematography that can happen. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, Ben? Because obviously so much is showing up at that early stage.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great thing. Undoubtedly, it's great. I think the challenge that the post-production find is that because previs is starting to look so good, you never really want to take a step back. And so post-production is finding ways around that in terms of like making sure the visual quality is up to scratch early on, even for sort of in the past animation dailies and stuff might be kind of gray or have gray elements in them and things. So the fact now that previs is on Unreal and in general it looks beautiful, there's a little level that we have to climb to in post-production really before it can kind of assemble the full scene again. So that's the sort of downside, but on there's so many plus sides. Don Burgess, who's the DOP on the movie, and other DOPs in general for virtual production, they can light, they can do all this other stuff which informs the post-production later on.
I always like thinking of the amazing lineage of virtual production work that Robert Zemeckis and his team around him have had essentially since Polar Express, and continuing with Kevin now, and also all the companies that they're collaborating with in terms of previs, virtual production, LED walls, simulcam, and obviously MPC has been doing incredible work with virtual production. You were on One and Only Ivan, I think, as well, Ben.
Yeah.
I guess I'm fishing for a bit of like a state of play thing. It always feels like there's multiple different tools and techniques coming into sets now and just being used where they're needed. It's not like virtual production means one thing and maybe it never did.
Yeah, exactly. I think I guess what I would say to that is that it's probably a side effect of it being new. Like I imagine in the future it will kind of consolidate into more of like, okay, this is a sort of suite of tools that we kind of use and everyone's used to it. But yeah, I think with things like virtual production where it's sort of bleeding edge and everyone's doing different things and trying out different ways. I mean, there are also sort of different usages. Virtual production generally at the moment is sort of LED panels, in camera. But obviously, this movie and well, I would say most, a lot of other movies use it for the other side of that, which is all the sort of full CG camera shooting, shooting full CG scenes and things like that. So yeah, the vernacular is sort of all over the place a little bit, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Ben, there's so much to talk about with this film in terms of sequences and characters. I was thinking, in terms of the visual effects work, we could just talk about the workshop, which is really
Yeah.
impressive. What did they actually shoot in terms of live action for the quite lengthy workshop sequence?
Yeah, well, the Geppetto's workshop was actually one of the only sort of scenes, I think actually the only scene that was built, sorry, scene set that was built fully in live action. Some were partial builds on set, for where Tom Hanks, who played Geppetto, would be, but the workshop was a full build. And so up to that point, we had been doing previews, so we know roughly what the sequence was going to be, or what the characters would sort of be doing within that environment. But when the amazing sort of set building team had built this insanely intricate workshop with honestly like millions of little things on the shelves and stuff like that, we sort of really had to dive in and replicate that, and we built the whole thing. We recreated that entire set in CG, and it was a really cool experience, really, because Bob would be shooting the live action, and mostly he shot, Tom Hanks, he shot his coverage as he would do, in a normal sort of live action movie, and then at the same time go into the virtual production bullpen where we would have sort of camera equipment and shoot in that same set with all the close-ups of Jiminy and things like that, when he's running across the clock walls and things. So it was very similar in a way, where you were really just shooting in the live action set with real cameras, and then you would move to the other room and shoot the CG set with the CG characters. So yeah, pretty interesting.
I'm not sure I've quite followed it. When you say the other room, you mean a virtual room, or do you mean it was?
Oh no, I mean, sorry, I sort of elaborate. So it was all shot in Cardington in the UK,
Yep,
Cardington Studios, these big hangars. And so, the set was built there, and then there was another room off to the side where we'd have some monitors up and Vive capture stuff, so Bob could do shooting in the virtual set
I
as
see.
well.
Sorry, of course, and shoot
Yeah.
his virtual cameras and
Yeah.
simulcam essentially as well, right? Yeah,
Yeah, and we had the same set. We had that same CG virtual set visible in the simulcam for the live action as well, so we could do lineups with the characters and things like that.
of course. It's of course very common that these live action sets are scanned, LiDAR'd for the purpose of recreating them, and also just for match moves and things like that. This one sounds incredibly complicated. I mean, were
Yeah.
you able to start on the CG build process pretty early on?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll speak to it sort of because I sort of saw a bit of it happening. But the guys at Mold 3D were the guys building the original set, and we had to do that process that you just described there, but we had to do it really quick. So they built the set, and then the guys went in and scanned it that night, and then brought it back in. And for the most part, the guys would just adjust the proportions of the existing sort of previs build so that it matched exactly the live action one, just in sort of scale and position of the shelves and things like that. So there was already one built, but we had to do this really quick, like conform to make sure that like it actually matched the one that was built on set before we could kind of, properly line it up for simulcam and things like that.
And that sequence in the final film, it just has so much going on in it, apart from the CG characters, which we'll talk about in a minute. But were you adding in, extra components that maybe weren't there on the day, like extra clocks or, other things?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, we built what was there. There were a couple of clock swaps and things like that we did just specifically for Jiminy's action. So yeah, there were a couple of different designed clocks that weren't there on the set that we introduced later in
Mm.
the movie for like little key pieces. But for the most part, we just had to sort of concentrate on really sort of recreating that exact environment.
And uh, another thing I wanted to ask you about is are those main characters. Let's talk about Jiminy, for example. I mean, he there's a scale issue that you have to overcome, but there's a performance issue because, and when I say issue, I just mean a challenge that you have to deal with. You know, his essential character. What were the things that MPC was doing to deal with getting a performance, but also dealing with scale?
Yeah. Yeah, Jiminy was great to work on really. The scale issue came up a lot of sort of times. Bob was really keen actually to never really show Jiminy in a kind of macro level. You know,
Right.
like that might be the sort of instinct is to sort of when you really are in on Jiminy's shots to have a normal f8 camera aperture or something, and it would be really shallow depth of field. But Bob wanted to avoid that, and he was always saying, "Let's just shoot Jiminy as if he was a human-sized man, right?" And the world was big, so a lot of Jiminy's shots were actually sort of really low f-stops, like f32 and things like that, to sort of to try and kind of keep away from the macro sort
Mm.
of look a little bit. But at the same time, um, the things like the detail in the costume and all that sort of stuff had to be like to scale. So, really like big threads and stuff in his chunky knit costume and stuff, so that we tried to get the scale in other ways like that. And one of the things that really helped us with that build was that the costume department actually built live action costumes, even for Jiminy, who is a full CG character. So he never appears in the movie, but they did build a real costume. And what that meant is that we got really amazing kind of like handcrafted kind of detail, but also like all the sort of fuzziness and real scale kind of like reference for how something that small would sort of both move as well as look.
And I, I guess I'll ask this about Pinocchio as well, but was there any kind of special approach to facial animation, lip sync, or anything like that, given that you had live action actors reading the lines? But was that ever a part of the way, the workflow for these characters?
Yeah, I mean Pinocchio in particular. Uh, there wasn't anything necessarily so special in terms of lip sync. Although I will say that the animation team definitely developed a bit of a style that was a little more sort of snappy on this movie than I guess they were always trying to kind of get. I'm going to say the word staccato, but that's maybe not quite
Mm.
right. But for Pinocchio, we were always trying to find ways to introduce a little bit of the wooden feel to him, right? So his joints and limbs, had a little bit of looseness and sort of clackiness to them. The mouth movements and things would be just a little bit sharper in terms of like the attack, and they wouldn't really ever be so like they wouldn't ever really move slowly or be quite kind of soft in a way. So the animation team were sort of really keen to try and get that quite, sort of sharp. And then the other thing that was a sort of technical and a sort of artistic challenge was just to make sure that the face moved correctly in terms of it being made out of wood. And a lot of the time in CG, if something's made out of wood, it's a nightmare because you either move it and it looks rubbery, or you kind of there's a couple of different ways you can kind of make it feel as if it's stop motion and it's been carved out of a different block of wood every frame and things like that. And so we went for the approach of just trying to make sure that the eyes and the eyebrows and things like that looked like they were painted on in every frame. So and things like the wood grain as well, which wouldn't move with the mouth movements 100%, but it does move a little bit. So we ended up in this halfway house where we tried to avoid the rubbery wood look, and we sort of tried to get this feeling of, it might have been painted per frame.
Mm. I was going to ask you about whether there had been some explorations in terms of the marionette feel. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's there's different scenarios that Pinocchio's in, but in the workshop and I guess all over the film, where did you go with those explorations?
Yeah, I mean, it was something we knew at the beginning, really, of this movie, is that
Mm.
we'd have to sort of look at puppets and especially the other puppets as well for the dancing, in the caravan. So, yeah, we had a great puppeteer, Ronnie, on set, who's and who did a lot of the live action puppeteering as well for parts in the workshop. And we just collected loads of reference of the puppets. There was a full live action Pinocchio built, so he
Oh,
was
right.
a puppet that was made, which we scanned and fully sort of recreated. So that was perfect reference. We had loads of reference footage of him being puppeteered for real, and so the animators could see how the head lolls around and how much kind of looseness there is in the limbs and things like that. So yeah, he was great. Sabina was the other puppet character that had a live action sort of version made as well. So yeah, we just took tons of reference footage and tried to recreate as faithfully as we could.
I wasn't 100% sure that there'd been any kind of live action puppetry, mainly either to avoid. Well, I'm so glad there was, but it's interesting because
Yeah.
some directors can decide, look, we don't want to try and inform it too much, or we don't want to copy that too much. Could you depart from it where you needed to? Could you, copy it where you needed to? I guess you've just said that as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Bob was really keen to do whatever was needed, right? In terms of the animation. The animation guys had a lot of freedom to over embellish. It was this movie is very animated in a way, right? It's sort of overly it's embellished, it's pushed a bit far, it's a little bit more fun. I
Mm.
wouldn't go as far as saying cartoony, but it's more it's bigger than larger than life, you know what I mean, in terms of
Yeah.
animation. So we could definitely push it.
I thought that was maybe especially the case with the cat, Figaro. It just
Yeah,
felt a bit more heightened than a normal cat. Possibly my favorite character in the film, Ben.
yeah,
Tell me about Figaro.
yeah. I think he was supposed to be sort of the grumpy teenager of the family, but yeah, he's sort of which fits a cat character pretty well. But yeah, the animators loved animating him. He's always sort of giving Geppetto little sideways glances and things like that. So they had a lot of fun. Even in like background shots, he's always doing something and kind of making a little joke to himself or something. It's a really great character.
In the workshop and actually in the film itself, there is something very lush and deep about the colours and the lighting there. I wanted to ask you about both whether some of that or all of that could be informed from the virtual production, virtual cinematography, and whether Don Burgess could inform that himself. But also then just generally what your lighters and how your compositors and rendering tools were used to do that.
Yeah, I think Don definitely had a huge, involvement in both lighting obviously the live action sets, but also the virtual sets as well. So we definitely had a mood defined, in that respect. All of the amazing artwork as well, the concept art on the movie was so amazingly done with Doug Chang and Stefan Deschamps had done, and they were it was a hugely rich kind of palette anyway. And I think that the movie was that kind of fairy tale sort of vibe. So
Mm.
really kind of lush and intricate visuals. And for the most part, we really sort of took all the lighting from the set or the lighting that Don had set up in the virtual production in scenes as guidance, really, and a lot of the time as 100% this is the angle of the sun, and we took it from the Unreal scene, and Don had set it up, and that's it, so we use that. So yeah, it was really heavily involved, driven by the virtual production. And then obviously if there's anything else needed or embellishments, our guys can do it. We we use Katana and RenderMan still at NPC, and it's a great tool set. Really, it allows them to get a level of realism and a level of control, that we need for that sort of stuff. And we did, I'm as a visual effects supervisor, I'm always pushing the guys to keep it real, in terms of materials, so all the materials that were in the environment, we really try to make sure are real materials, and all the, things like, I hate to say things like light linking and stuff, right, which is a bit of an old school sort of phrase, but making sure the lighting is completely physical, so that it feels grounded and it feels realistic.
I think that really shows in terms of the cloth, the clothing worn by Pinocchio and other characters here. I mean, that's something that's, as you say, there's an animated side to this film, but it is grounded in reality. And I felt that actually came a lot from seeing the weaves and the, just the cloth simulation that you did there. So I just wanted to shout that out in particular, Ben.
Yeah, the guys did a great job on that, and I think it partly comes from the live action builds of those objects, because when you're copying something like that, there's no question as to like, oh, should this material have some fur, some groom on it, or not. And if you've got a live action thing to look at, you're going, yeah, like literally everything has groom, right? And so we did that on this movie. It's like every piece of clothing would be groomed by the groom team as well, and it just gives it that extra level of kind of fidelity and realism.
Yeah. Well, Ben, as I say, there's just so much to talk about, and I'm glad to have restricted it to virtual production, but also the workshop. However, I am going to ask you whether there was a shot in the workshop, a one-er or some other one-er in the film that was, your most tricky, your most challenging. Bob Zemeckis always has them, as we mentioned before. Kevin seems to find one each film. Is there one that you can think of that you wanted to mention?
I think, I don't know if tricky is the right word, but certainly the one that took kind of the longest to get right, as expected, was the opening shot, because we have to do this opening shot of Jiminy and a dissolve from the Disney castle as well. So there's that sort of extra element coming down into the village with two Jiminy crickets, and it was quite tricky to get the story parts of the shot that were needed, establishing the village and sticking with Jiminy, this macro character, down onto the sort of real macro ground. And that was actually, that sort of element was something which we had challenges with in the whole show, was the macro Jiminy world versus the full set, because we have to build these huge worlds, and then Jiminy would stand on like 1.25 inch square of ground, over here, and we never quite knew exactly where it'd be. So we always had to like dive in and do these, super sort of detailed little bits of environments that the environments team deal with, to sort of manage that sort of scale, the macro level and the huge scale as well.
Oh, cool. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the opening shot, because that's one of the great ones as well. Ben, thank you so much for joining me on Befores and Afters. Really great to chat to you again.
Anytime. Thank you very much.